Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, Susan, Danny, and Sumi. Thank you for joining us virtually from the United States. Welcome to today's special workshop titled U.S. Foreign Policy at Crossroads, Ukraine, the Middle East, Taiwan, and North Korea. As everyone here is well aware, the international community has been faced with unprecedented geopolitical and geoeconomic headwinds in 2023. The ongoing war in Ukraine, unimaginable violence caused by Israel-Hamas conflict, growing tensions in the Taiwan Straits, and North Korea's relentless nuclear and missile provocation continue to threaten global peace and stability, and the Korean Peninsula as well. These international crises present a unique situation in the following aspect. First, these conflicts are taking place simultaneously, making them impossible for the United States to handle alone, which entail consolidated response and greater coordination with U.S. allies. Second, this new pattern of multi-frontier wars has stretched military resources and strategic capabilities to their limits. Coordinating operations across multiple theaters has increased the complexity of decision-making, logistics, and intelligence, and heightened the risk of miscalculations. Third, scientific innovation has transformed the nature of modern warfare. While technology has enhanced military capabilities, it has also made warfare more complicated, unpredictable, and costly than ever before, and has challenged U.S. foreign policy to make appropriate recalibration. Ladies and gentlemen, in the midst of such turbulent times, we are faced here to discuss how the U.S. could manage ongoing wars in Ukraine and Middle East and prevent flashpoint in North Korea and Taiwan Straits from escalating into actual military conflicts. It is my understanding that up until now, the worst scenario for the United States to cope with was in two fronts at a given time. Today, however, the United States faces the prospect of having to deal with 3 or even 4 conflicts at the same time. Today, I'm very happy to have top-level specialists from the United States who can explain how the U.S. can tide over the simultaneously accumulated crises at this moment. I call them the Avengers of U.S. policymaking community here to save us from the challenges posed by today's global crisis. We have Mr. Rexon RYU, President of Asia Group, who will focus on the military and the strategic aspect of Ukraine war and Middle East based on his invaluable experiences as Chief of Staff to the legendary Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel. And we also have Susan Thornton and Danny Russell, who both served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. They are the best people to talk on the future of Taiwan, but not limited to that issue. On North Korean issues and U.S.-Korean alliance issues, we are fully equipped with top specialists. Dr. Sumi Terry, the founder of Peninsula Strategies, Mr. Scott Snyder, new president of Korea Economic Institute of America, and Ambassador Jo Yoon, the former special presidential envoy for compact negotiations. Ladies and gentlemen, if you allow me, I'd like to take this opportunity to shed light on the North Korean nuclear provocation issues. First of all, I'm pleased to declare that the past 70 years of the Korea-US alliance has been more than successful in the sense that it has prevented a second Korean War. At the same time, I'm extremely discouraged by the fact that we have fumbled every opportunity to suffocate North Korea's nuclear ambition during the last 3 decades. All diplomatic démarches since the early 1990s have failed completely, ranging from bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral, and even sextilateral, including six-party talks. The US, Korea, and even China have allowed North Korea to enjoy the sense of impunity and carte blanche over the past 3 decades. Such repeated failure to denuclearize North Korea have led to growing frustration and concern and anxiety on the part of Korean public. I believe their overshadowing concern over their safety have led to growing public support to develop its own nuclear weapons. According to Chey Institute Gallup Korea poll result last December, 76% of Koreans supported Korea's development of indigenous nuclear weapons. North Korea's extremely developed nuclear program has reminded Koreans of the dilemma in 1961 between President de Gaulle and President Kennedy, who hesitated to commit to trading New York for Paris in case of Soviet nuclear attack. It has also raised concerns that such a dilemma may be replicated on the Korean Peninsula now. On the top of that, the unpredictability posed by President Trump's potential re-election has only added to such concern. In a 2016 interview with New York Times, then President candidate Trump said that he would be open to allowing Japan and Korea to build their own nuclear arsenals rather than depends on American nuclear umbrella. He also said he would be willing to withdraw United States forces from both Korea and Japan. Even though he later disavowed his comments, his statement remained a great trauma in the hearts and minds of Korean people. The Chey Institute will conduct its second round of opinion survey next month. I hope that the Washington Declaration last April and historic trilateral Camp David summit among the US, Korea, and Japan will provide enough assurances to the Korean people to the extent that it will significantly lower the support rate of Korean people to possess its own indigenous nuclear weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, if you allow me, I'd like to take this opportunity to propose 3 action plans that I hope will come to exemplify the US-Korea alliance that is befitting the next 70 years. Korea's transformation into a leading country in scientific innovation can revolutionize the nature of the US-Korea alliance. It is high time to go beyond the traditional military alliance and to transform into a new alliance of technology and scientific innovation. First, I suggest the creation of US-Korea bilateral or US-Korea-Japan trilateral international consortium for the production and supply of enriched uranium for the civil nuclear power plants. From an industrial perspective, the current enriched uranium market is dominated by Russia's Rosatom with 46%, and China with 10 to 15% of world market share that supply enriched uranium to 450 civil nuclear power plants operating around the world. Accordingly, there are growing concerns about the Russian and the Chinese oligopoly of the commercial enriched uranium supply chain. Even the United States today is importing 22% of enriched uranium from Russia. This imposes serious threats to sustainable global nuclear energy security in case of supply chain bottlenecks, including any decision by Russia or China to cut down supplies. This oligopoly will be the second global supply chain in any moment in the near future. Based on the great success story of strong US-Korea military alliance, a new technology alliance in the form of Chip 4 alliance in semiconductor vividly epitomizes a new era of scientific alliance. Second, another possible US-Korea consortium on cutting-edge technology is the supply of nuclear-powered submarine on global base. Since 1920, the U.S. Jones Act has prevented the production of naval ships outside American soil. It is observed that this may have led to skyrocketing prices of submarines and naval shipbuilding. Moreover, it is observed that the United States cannot match the speed of China in the shipbuilding industry. Now is the optimal time for the United States and Korea to actively explore new cooperation on the issue of creating consortium for nuclear-powered submarines to utilize Korea's absolute comparative advantage in terms of proven world-class shipbuilding technology, including established docks and experienced workforce. Lastly, enhancing cooperation in emerging space technologies. The real-time surveillance through space intelligence is crucial for detecting major activities of North Korean nuclear facilities, identifying and tracking North Korean transporter electron launchers or THOR, and eventually making North Korean nuclear arsenals and facilities obsolete. Korea is planning to launch 44 small military satellites along with 5 4-5 reconnaissance satellites in low Earth orbit by 2030. However, this is not enough to perfectly deter North Korean nuclear and missile threats in real-time trackings. I hope that the Camp David Summit will serve as a good momentum to vigorously improve trilateral interoperability and integration of space surveillance and system among the US, Korea, and Japan. I thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to start this special workshop. Today we have the privilege of hearing from some of the most renowned experts from the United States and Korea on the 4 major conflicts that are threatening global peace and security. First, I would like to invite Mr. Rexon RYU to speak on Washington's strategy for Ukraine and Middle East. Here, I'd like to suggest just guiding questions, 2 or 3 questions to enrich our discussion, but you don't have to stick to my questions. First, when will the Ukraine war will end? It took the US more than 10 years to withdraw from Afghanistan, 8 years to withdraw from Iraq, and it took the Soviet Union 10 years to withdraw from its war in Afghanistan. It means that, even though I don't like to try to generalize, but once the power are involved in such a big war, it usually lasted around 10 years. So what's your prospect? And second, how has the Ukraine war affected security and prosperity, in Asia, especially in Taiwan, and how has it further emboldened Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping for their further action? Third, Ukraine might have to compete with Israel for the United States' attention and support. How will this change the course of the 2 wars? Will this accelerate or decelerate tensions. So, but you don't have to limit it to my question. Thank you. Let's welcome Rexon.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everyone around the table. And Susan and Sumi and Danny, nice to see you on the screen. Danny, I give you extra credit for having a mountain bike in your background there. So I'll offer a few opening comments, Ambassador, that hopefully in the course of them will start to offer some perspectives on the questions you've asked and hopefully a few other perspectives. What I would say about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the eruption of conflict in the Middle East between Hamas and Israel is that I tend to think about each of these with a basic statement that the complexity is incredible across each of these, and that I try to have a framework that looks at three key dimensions, if you will, that hopefully encompasses several of the key aspects. The first is the nature of the battlefield conflict. The second is the nature of the geopolitical dynamics of each conflict. And the third is the politics of the protagonists in each conflict. Each of these have different characteristics. They interact with each other within each conflict, and then they interact across the conflicts, which makes the complexity very hard to offer predictions. But what I would say is, when I look at Ukraine, that this appears to be a conflict that is likely to extend for a fair amount of time. I don't see an end coming soon, is the basic answer. The dimensions that we're all very familiar on the battlefield begin with substantial capability with Ukraine and Russia, each having certain advantages. The dimension I think to watch is the reliance of Ukraine on external support. And that issue is, as Zelensky knows very well, a key dimension with uncertainty here in the United States. However, I anticipate that from a battlefield perspective, this conflict will extend throughout 2024, and that the timelines will be reinforced by the politics and the geopolitics. The biggest issue, in my view, is the election, as you alluded to, Ambassador, here or in the United States in November of 2024, and the uncertainty that presents with respect to strategic direction for the United States, particularly as it relates to Russia. In my view, with the battlefield the way it is, neither side has any incentive at this stage to move towards a political solution. I don't believe the debate that we see unfolding in our Congress with respect to support for Ukraine ultimately will materially impact decisions over the next year by the Biden administration to provide military support, and I don't believe it will impact the overall global support for Ukraine from the United States, from Europe, our NATO allies, and for other countries around the world, to include South Korea, Japan, and others. And so the nature of the dimensions that I described, in my view, push us towards an extended conflict on the ground. Second, Israel and Hamas in the Middle East. Much more uncertainty, in my view, here across all three of the dimensions. Fairly clear statements by Bibi Netanyahu with respect to his military objectives. The timeline for the military operations, I think, is very unclear and quite a bit more vulnerable to pressures politically and geopolitically. We're also talking about a much smaller geography when it comes to Gaza. And so, in my view, the larger question is one that blends the active operations that define the conflict right now with what comes after. And I think the fact that you had the US Secretary of State come out within the last week or so with statements that projected to the political dimensions of Gaza post-conflict, who will administer Gaza, gives you a sense that the key protagonists are looking beyond this phase of the military conflict right now. And the question, I think, squarely on the table in US-Israel relations is around the prospect of an extended occupation by Israel and the implication that carries geopolitically in the region and globally. The fact that you had the Iranian president visiting Saudi Arabia, motivated by the plight of the Palestinian people and the conflict in Gaza, gives you a sense of how the military conflict is reorienting geopolitics right now. And that carries implications for the United States regionally, but potentially globally, and for countries like South Korea and Japan, and China as well, where you have heavy reliance on energy sources from the Middle East. There is an interesting dynamic around the role of China in the Middle East. My assessment of China's reaction in the early stages of this conflict was one where they were looking to avoid any particular commitments in their statements. I also believe that there is an incentive for Beijing to avoid regionalization of this conflict, with the potential implications, again, as I mentioned, for energy markets in particular. And so, as we think about, for example, the upcoming meeting for President Biden with President Xi, you have to think that on the agenda, while it may not be the first agenda item, but on the agenda is discussing the Middle East and a role that China may play, as reluctant as they may be, in seeking to prevent actions, particularly by Iran, that could provoke escalation. The larger sort of consideration that I would offer participants and folks to react to, including my colleagues on the screen, is that you mentioned conflict on two fronts. And absolutely true that the decision-making resources of the Biden administration and the national security structure are now oriented particularly towards these two theaters and these two conflicts. I would offer, though, that at the same time, you have the Secretary of Defense here in Seoul right now on a 3-country visit, having been to India, visiting here, and going to Indonesia, with the Secretary of State also visiting South Korea and Japan within the last week, and an incredible focus over a number of months, not just weeks, but months, with the Biden administration, with the Chinese, leading up to the expected meeting of the two leaders later this week. I remind participants of those events to underscore the fact that I have a lot of confidence that our capacity to manage the complexities remains quite strong. I would also note that from a military perspective, our deployments in Europe have not materially changed over the last year or so as a result of the Ukraine crisis. We've seen a dramatic expansion of NATO, which we have welcomed. We do have a substantial amount of military power deployed in the Mediterranean, intended as a deterrent. But I think that capacity is quite sustainable in the context of the risks you noted, Ambassador, with respect to the Korean Peninsula, as well as the ever-present risk of some incident around Taiwan. We retain an incredible amount of military capacity in the Indo-Pacific and the Asia theater that I believe remains quite deep, despite the redeployments in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean. Two other comments that I might end with here. The first is the substantial issue of China's nuclear modernization in this larger rubric here that we are talking about in terms of complexity. This is an incredibly significant issue, one that I think we will, over the months and years to come, see more and more of as a key national security issue that we will need to grapple with Beijing, our nuclear allies, as well as with Moscow. We are in the early stages of this, particularly due to reluctance by the Chinese, I would say, to engage us on this matter. The second, even in this era of complexity and volatility, issue that I would like to leave participants with is that I would submit that our network of alliances and deep partnerships has never been stronger, whether you look at the Asia-Pacific theater or the Europe theater. And we will rely on partners, as you know, even more today going forward. But I think the investments of the last number of years and the modernizations and innovations in how we engage allies and partners will prove critical for us going forward. So, Ambassador, I'll stop there and turn it back over to you. Okay. Thank you.
To invite our Chinese specialists on Chinese issues, I'd like to, for your second round presentation, I'd like to raise very quick two questions.
Sure.
First one is, you just mentioned that both sides are less interested in resorting to a political solution. So, and then you mentioned that it's very unlikely for us to have the ending of Ukraine war very soon, near soon. So in that case, my original question was that, from my perspective or observation, it lasts at least around 8 years in case of recent powers involvement in major war. So do you think Russia will treading the same precedent? I mean, it will. Now we just only 1.5 years have passed, so we have to wait another 8.5 years. If they, so that's my question. I'd like to ask your personal hunch. And second issue is on the Hamas-Israel conflict. One of my great concerns is that it might a replica of Syrian refugee cases, which lasted very long because of the conflict of interest of great powers, and eventually led to the Brexit of UK from EU because of they are faced with the serious refugee problem from Syria. So as of now, it might be very minor issues, but the refugee issues from Palestinian area might another explosive, explosive, new development. That is my another question, for you. No, second round. Okay. Next, we have Professor Susan Thornton and Mr. Danny Russell, which I just briefly mentioned. Especially, thank you for their participation through the out of their very, very hectic schedule. So my question is that there are various, scenarios on the issue of the invasion of Chinese invasion of Taiwan. There are many arguments on the US side, but generally speaking, most of the high-level officials predicted that it will be almost highly probable that China will invade Taiwan from 2027 to through 2030s. But this year, the last January, the Chinese, Premier, Li, categorically denied that, it's nonsense. It will never happen on the Chinese side. So maybe there are two, conditions that as long as United States uphold the one China policy and Taiwan never declare their independence. So what is your views on the possible invasion of China of Taiwan? And the second thing is what is the next round of competition and the final destination? In case of Trump, Biden administration, they are focusing on decoupling. But now they changed their they slightly changes into the small yard high fence or de-risking. So this is kind of reinforced or amelioration of the competition. That's the question. And next week, President Biden and President Xi Jinping are expected to meet in San Francisco. So that event could good momentum for another rapprochement between two countries. But you don't have to limit it to these two questions. So can I invite Susan first? I'm very impressed with your keynote speeches in China. Okay, Susan.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Park, and it's great to see everybody there in Seoul this morning and my colleagues on screen here tonight, Sunday night in the US. These are not easy questions that you're asking, Ambassador Park, but I'll do my best. So, to me, I do think that we see a lot of these conflicts now stressing out our national policymaking structures. And clearly, the Biden administration is assuring everyone that they could still pivot to Asia should there be a conflict in Asia. But, we know that these two conflicts are taking up enormous amount of bandwidth among our leaders and policymakers right now. Of course, we'll have everybody out at APEC next week, including half the cabinet and a huge number of the national security team. So I think that shows that, there is still the ability to focus on Asia when there is something important happening there. But I do think that the key to maintaining the stability in Asia is going to very much center around the future of the U.S.-China relationship, including the Korean Peninsula. I think the China angle on DPRK developments is very important. And, to me, the apparent effort to try to isolate China in Asia after all these decades of trying to integrate China into Asia and into the global system is a mistake. And I know that people will say that, well, we're not trying to isolate China in Asia, but it certainly appears along a lot of axes that is what we are trying to do, or that is what is happening. Certainly what the Chinese perceive that we're trying to do. And I just have to say that I think that the strategy of integrating China into Asia and into the global system was really the only realistic approach for this problem. And that the kind of effort now to try to drive China, off into its own corner in Asia was really the result of this kind of panicked overreaction. And, this impulse to see gains that China was making in different parts of the world as a commensurate loss for U.S. influence and standing in the world, which I think is just wrong. So, I've been a critic of the current approach, this kind of intense competition with China. I think that it's an open question for me whether the U.S. political system could manage to contain a relationship that was declared as one of intense competition. Whether the U.S. political system could contain and control that kind of an impulse after declaring, another country a rival or enemy. And I think that the recent track record on that is not very hopeful. So, these are just cautions that I think we haven't really had a chance to think through and debate, given the trajectory on some of these policies over the last 7 years and the political underpinnings of a lot of them. And, I know that the Biden administration, it's good to see that this meeting is going to happen at APEC next week. And we keep talking about putting a floor under the U.S.-China relationship. But I think most people don't really believe that this floor that might be established next week is going to weather too well in the ensuing political campaign for the U.S. presidential election. So, I don't really think that the problem is that people might be worried that there's, going to be a U.S.-China G2 again. I think that the real problem is that the dynamic that we have now that's so focused on this kind of tit-for-tat competition and escalation is going to drive us toward conflict. And that's where the question about Taiwan comes in. I'm actually not as maybe pessimistic as some other people are on this issue. I think that there is still time before the kind of very dire scenario that you portrayed, this invasion scenario. I actually don't think an invasion scenario is very likely at all in the foreseeable future. I just don't think the invasion scenario is the one that the Chinese are likely to pursue. I think it may sound very unrealistic to us, but I think the Chinese actually believe that there is still a prospect out there for a peaceful reunification, and that they are going to pursue that and try to make an offer to the Taiwans, maybe an offer accompanied by some strong encouragement, but probably not an invasion as their first, sort of salvo in this process. And I think it'll be very difficult actually for us to respond to some of the things that the Chinese will put in play, because I don't think they're all going to be military. And in fact, most of them probably won't be military. And so I think we think a lot about the scenario being a military one. And I think it's probably, given that those are not the tools that the Chinese generally turns to as a first resort, and given that we know that they'd like to pursue peaceful reunification and that they still think that they can persuade the Taiwans, as unrealistic as that may seem to us. I think that that is the kind of thing that we should expect to see, and that it's going to be gradual, not sudden in the next 2 or 3 years. I think that the questions over the economic contestation between the U.S. and China are actually a bit more worrisome to me. And I think it's very difficult to see really how this small yard is going to be limited or defined. It appears that it should be, a reasonable prospect to try to limit the scope of, actions that are considered in the national security ambit. But given the political environment, it seems to me it's going to be very difficult to calibrate this either de-risking versus decoupling or small yard versus bigger yard. And I just think it's not clear to me yet that this is, as much as the Biden administration says that it's going to very narrowly target and tailor these policies, which I'm sure they intend to do, it doesn't seem like the executive branch is necessarily going to have its hands on the controls where that's concerned. And I just would refer back to my earlier statement, which is that our political system has not shown much ability to constrain or rein in excesses when it comes to, measures directed at a declared enemy. So I think here, this is going to become part of doing business, and it's going to be difficult to see where the edge of this is going to be. So I'm sorry if that's painting a bit of a pessimistic picture. I do hope that this meeting next week will kind of help us to find some kind of a stabilization for a period of time, but seems to me it's not a very long-term prospect at this point. I'll stop there.
Thank you. But generally speaking, you are a little optimistic than the average, the U.S. expert on Chinese issues. And if I give some additional question for your second round, as you might be well aware, last year, China-U.S. Trade volume hit the record high. So do you think it is it's kind of the result of some failure of the Biden administration policy vis-a-vis China, or this is a new exit for the rapprochement? That is how you could interpret that kind of record high record trade volumes. And second, on the Korean side, we have there are some requests from the private sectors that there should be no. We have to improve the unbalance between onshore and friend shoring. I mean, onshoring and friend shoring, because to protect some sunken investment of Korean companies, which have some huge investment in China in the past. So how we could, compensate, their some unexpected, loss or some damages. So I hope you can have some better ideas, during your second presentation. Now I'd like to invite Danny Russell. I think you have some further comment based on our discussion up until now.
Susan covered a lot of ground. I won't replicate it, although I will say on the issue of the Taiwan invasion scenario that there's a big difference between the risk of a military action by China, a risk that we have to take very seriously and deter and prepare for, and whether or not China actually has a plan, in other words, whether China intends to unify Taiwan by force of arms. I think that the preferred Chinese strategy, probably choices 1 through 9, are not a full-on amphibious invasion for a number of good reasons, but rather to isolate Taiwan, to demoralize the population, to intimidate them, to coerce them, to co-opt the leadership to the extent possible, and to convince people on Taiwan, first of all, that being absorbed by the mainland is an inevitability. Secondly, to demonstrate the inability of the United States to protect Taiwan or to block the PRC from coercive measures, and leave a sense among the Taiwan public that resistance is futile. And that kind of demoralized public forms the basis for beginning a process with relatively small political concessions by the Taiwan leadership that gradually turn into bigger and bigger concessions as the mainland applies more pressure and makes more headway. In any event, on Taiwan, just backing up for a moment, in terms of the U.S. strategy, which is what you had asked about in your email originally, I'd make two sets of points. One, it's very important to remember that the U.S. strategy with respect to Taiwan is rooted in the conviction that American credibility globally is at stake, and also that key U.S. national interests are at stake. The credibility part is obvious. If the United States can't deter coercion, can't defend Taiwan, and sort of what good are American security guarantees that obviously would weaken confidence in the United States and our alliance commitments. With respect to national security, there is a straight up strategic military risk if the PRC were able to control Taiwan and control the area surrounding Taiwan. There is obviously a non-trivial risk of conflict with another nuclear power, China. And there's a more general national interest in maintaining security and stability and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region, all of which would be devastated by conflict. And of course, there are key interests in terms of American security interests, economic security. There's a massive dependence on Taiwan semiconductors, for starters. And there's also the importance of safeguarding democratic society against coercion, especially thriving Chinese democracy, which is a living rebuttal to Chinese Communist Party propaganda in any event. So what we see in the Biden administration's strategy are a number of important elements. I'd say the first one is deterrence, and that comes from U.S. military capability. As Rexon pointed out, the U.S. maintains phenomenal military capability in the Asia-Pacific region, and China is highly attentive to that. And as Susan pointed out, since the U.S. isn't actually a combatant in either the Ukraine war or the Gaza war, the competition is for bandwidth in the national security community in Washington. And as Rexon said, the U.S. has just demonstrated through the visit of the secretaries of state and defense, the engagement of the president, et cetera, that there's enough bandwidth to cover Asia, for sure. The second, and in terms of deterrence also, I mean, there are pretty clear warnings. Biden has made some very unsubtle hints about American resolve. And of course, when he meets with Xi Jinping, without a doubt, he will reaffirm the deterrent message. But at the same time, the second piece is reassurance, and we should expect him to similarly reaffirm his famous 4 no's and 1 no intentions. In other words, that the United States does not support Taiwan independence, that there is no change in the one China policy. Now, he's speaking to a highly skeptical audience on both of those fronts, but these expressions of assurance are very important, particularly when they're delivered in person by the President of the United States directly to the President of China. I think a third element of the strategy is enhancing Taiwan's self-defense capabilities. It's providing defensive military equipment, providing intelligence, providing training, pushing Taiwan to an asymmetric defense that really raises the risk phenomenally to Xi Jinping that attack would, although it could destroy a lot of real estate and kill a lot of other Chinese people on Taiwan, that it would be very, very uncertain. There's also the confidence building component of the Biden administration strategy, which is through high-level visits, through various statements, through all kinds of symbolic gestures, conveying to the people on Taiwan that the United States is paying attention, is committed, is concerned, is supportive. And that's not insignificant given, as I said, that demoralizing the people in Taiwan is a goal for is a part of the Chinese strategy. They're strengthening economic ties, encouraging Taiwan to diversify its economy, to reduce dependency on the mainland and have more options. There's helping Taiwan by raising the global profile of the Taiwan issue and building a network of partners that are thwarting the Chinese effort to isolate Taiwan, and also are signaling international focus and potential consequences to China were it to take military action. There is now, of course, another part of the strategy is supporting and respecting Taiwan's democracy, which means that with respect to the election that's coming up in 2 months, the administration is trying to be scrupulously neutral. And lastly, as I mentioned in connection with the upcoming meeting in San Francisco, just 2 days away, there's diplomacy with China and the emphasis on the necessity of there being a peaceful resolution. So there's a mismatch in the Taiwan situation between what the public on Taiwan seems to find acceptable and what for Xi Jinping appears to be the non-negotiable must-have component of a settlement. For Xi Jinping, it sounds like nothing short of measurable progress toward unification is acceptable. And to the people on Taiwan, generally speaking, it would seem as if movement in that direction is unacceptable, that they're prepared to accept the status quo. They are willing to live with the status quo. They're not going to change in the direction of independence, largely because they realize what the consequences would be, but they have no intention of moving towards unification if they can avoid it. That gap doesn't seem bridgeable. And so we should expect that there will be a constant balancing act in an effort to buy time and to discourage and deter China from turning up the pressure dial, not only through military means, but through other forms of coercion. there's a strong connection between U.S.-China relations and the threat level on Taiwan. The worse U.S.-China relations are, the more difficult it is to maintain this kind of dynamic equilibrium. It's not really a status quo per se, but at least it's relatively stable and it's peaceful. I agree with Susan that we may be in a period of tactical pause in the U.S.-China rivalry. Both leaders have their own interests in stabilizing the situation for the time being, and hopefully the two leaders will have a serious talk about how to manage the upcoming year, 2024, without a catastrophe. But in the longer term, it's difficult to see that the structural drivers of tension between Washington and Beijing will be reversed. So don't unfasten your seatbelt. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much. So I think you are properly reflect the general atmosphere and academia, within the United States. Anyway, we could have some more discussion during the second round. And next, we have Mr. Scott Snyder and Dr. Sumi Terry, who will speak on U.S. foreign policy toward North Korea. Especially, Sumi Terry recently co-produced a critically acclaimed documentary film on North Korean refugees. So I think, I hope it is another successful incarnation of your, potential capability, talents. So I hope I congratulate on your another, career success story as film producers. And yes, I will open. I will invite Sumi Terry first, and then Scott Snyder. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So good morning to everybody in Seoul, and good evening to Danny and Susan. Thank you, Ambassador Park. Nice to see you again. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation with colleagues and friends. So let me briefly talk about what the current Biden administration's North Korea policy is before discussing the specifics of the guiding questions that you posed to us, Ambassador Park. The overall broad policy picture remains the same as when the Biden administration first came into the office, which is that at least rhetorically, the Biden administration continues to say it is pursuing a calibrated, practical approach while being open to diplomacy to eventually achieve denuclearization in North Korea. In reality, its policy, which appears to align with that of South Korea, has basically shifted from the alliance's emphasis on diplomacy to deterrence, in part by expanding the size and scope of bilateral military exercises, dispatching U.S. military assets to the region, and reinvigorating U.S., South Korea, Japan trilateral security cooperation. Washington Declaration is, of course, an attempt to reassure South Korea that despite intensifying North Korean nuclear threat on Seoul's doorstep, the alliance would be up to task of deterring North Korean attack, including the use of nuclear weapons. Now, regarding the specific guiding questions that you posed to us, first you asked about the North Korea-Russia relationship and whether the munition trade is symbolic or is actually helping either side. And I know there's some debate on this, and I understand those that make the argument that North Korea's artillery is, primitive, right? They're not smart shells. They can be guided by GPS and so on. And thus North Korea's help is not really any kind of game changer for Russia. But at the end of the day, Ukraine conflict is a war on supply side lines, war of supply lines, basically, of each side trying to produce and replenish more of its artillery and munition. So the bottom line here is North Korea, with its large stockpile of munitions, is helping Russia and Ukraine. And whether Russia really supplies the North with technology for satellites and nuclear power submarines remain to be seen. But how can this potential transfer of sensitive military technologies that could help accelerate North Korea's WMD program from military satellites to nuclear submarines to ICBM programs, how can it not be a concerning development for us? So this North Korea and Russia's unholy alliance can and does strengthen both countries. Then you ask, secondly, the question whether Washington Declaration is enough to pacify the Korean public. The short answer is it's good enough for now, but probably will not be in the future because, so first of all, Washington Declaration is absolutely an important software upgrade for the alliance. We don't need to debate that. It's an effort by the Biden administration to politically reassure Seoul that the U.S. president will seek input from South Korean president in a crisis. And this nuclear consultative forum is an important place to discuss nuclear and strategic planning. But consider the current reality. The external environment continues to be favorable for North Korea in that there's continues to be no repercussions whatsoever for North Korea's expanding WMD program. Absolutely zero help from Russia or China. There is no sign that Kim will get off this current path that he is on. He has also made it crystal clear that North Korea will never, ever, ever denuclearize. He says so. In fact, the regime adopted a new law that expands the conditions under which the North would use nuclear weapons, which of course includes non-nuclear attacks. So in the future, as the North completes its nuclear weapons with program with second strike capability, as you put it, Ambassador Park, and perhaps combining it with Trump's return to the White House, which is really 50-50 at this point, I would say. I don't think we can say that Washington Declaration will be enough in the long run for the Korean public. And now that leads to sort of the third and fourth guiding questions that you ask, which is on the impact of the second strike capability on the future of U.S. missile defense system, and then questions about Trump's possible second term. On the missile defense issue, look, North Korea's missile forces are expanding, and it's not only in quantity, but it has become increasingly diverse and mobile. They are increasingly becoming more sophisticated. Its reliability, its accuracy, its sophistication, not of just reentry vehicle, but decoys and penetration aids and sophistications associated with hypersonic missiles, which obviously the North Korea has been working on. All of this gives the North more capable ability to go up against our missile defense systems. Also, of the left of launch on detecting North Korean missiles on the pad, early warning, etc., North Korea's growing shift from liquid to solid rocket motor and solid propellant, which means obviously they don't have to have this extensive time to fuel before launch, which is a point of vulnerability. All of this makes things more complicated. The regime has been working on mobility. So no question, North Korea's missile forces are increasingly a tough target for us, and in terms of intercepting and so on. We obviously have sophisticated missile defenses in the region, theater missile defense, and homeland missile defense, and all the various elements of both systems, right? Ground-based interceptors and this extensive array of space-based, sea-based, land-based sensors, this command and control communications. They're all stitched together, and it's sophisticated, and we obviously have effective cooperation with South Korea. Washington does. And then there's a Japan piece, Korea and Japan's growing cooperation being able to integrate sensors or missile defenses would be extremely valuable. Still, there's no question that there is a lot of uncertainty, and North Korea's missiles pose a very significant threat. So we need to continue to evolve and improve our missile defense systems. Lastly, on your question on Trump, and you asked what would happen to U.S.-ROC alliance if Trump returns. Let me be frank. I'm not even. I left the Wilson Center, so let me be more frank. The U.S.-ROC alliance, I would think, would be strained. There's no reason to think that there will be no difference there, right? It certainly is not going to be what it is today. There's basically, at minimum, I would think that he would probably demand another massive increase in subsidies that Seoul provides to support U.S. Troops in South Korea. There's also no question in terms of, well, not no question, but there is a lingering question, let's put it that way, on what he really thinks about pushing for a potential withdrawal of U.S. forces and so on, if he doesn't get it. President Trump might look for another go-around with Kim on another round of nuclear summit diplomacy, which may put him at odds with more hardline Yoon Suk-yeol administration. So while we are, Washington and Seoul are absolutely, there's no daylight, I believe, right now on our North Korea policy. We're very, very much aligned, but I think there will be a big question mark if that would be the case. So I'm trying to answer as straightforwardly as I can to your 4 specific guiding questions.
Thank you, Sumi. You made a very excellent and eloquent and very comprehensive, presentation on North Korean nuclear issues. I wonder if there's any remaining topics for Scott to answer. But I think this is, as I told you, he just appointed as new president of Korea Economic Institute of America, or KEI. I think today, this occasion is the first public appearance after his nomination. Yeah, we need some special.
Well, thank you, Ngoc. You're right that Sumi's presentation was pretty comprehensive. I do need to just underscore, since this is a public presentation, that I have been appointed as the next president, but I don't take office until April 1st. So I want to make sure that there's no confusion about whether or not I'm misrepresenting myself at this time. Ambassador Park said that we were the Avengers, and of course Sumi is a producer, so I'm looking forward to seeing the movie version of this conference, and you've really packed a lot in. I think maybe what I can do is just to make a few observations that try to link at least Rexon's presentation and Sumi's, because I think that the Putin-Kim summit in particular was the strategic development that actually brings those two together. Of course, the Putin-Kim summit is really a product of narrow transactionalism, but it's a convergence of transactional interests between Russia and North Korea. So, that I think is the driver. And then for North Korea, my view is that it represents the emergence of Kim Jong-un's kind of foreign policy 2.0 as related to summitry. Because we saw an earlier round of summitry. Frankly, I thought the Hanoi summit was going to doom summitry for Kim Jong-un for some time. And yet we see him coming out, I think, pursuing the same objective, looking for international legitimation of his nuclear program, but now doing it in a very different geopolitical context of major power rivalry. And so in some way, meeting with Putin is actually a pretty good substitute for him, and it actually helps both of them to show that they're not completely isolated. They both live in the domain of the sanctioned together now, and that is a potential problem. It certainly is a problem as far as proliferation risks. And especially it's problematic if we think about the ways in which Russia's provision of military support for North Korea, in whatever form it materializes, actually breaks a sanctions effort internationally that had pretty much kept North Korea isolated in terms of military procurement, at least conventionally, for decades. And it had also imposed some limits on what North Korea could get, at least legally, or get through bilateral, I don't mean not legally, but through bilateral exchange formally with other partners. And of course, it links Asian and European security directly, because to the extent that North Korea supports Russia in Ukraine, it prolongs the war. To the extent that Russia supports North Korea, it expands North Korea's potential threat. And I think that the area that was most interesting is really the emergence of a kind of mutual deterrence dynamic between Russia and South Korea, actually, to the extent that Putin and Kim Jong-un, in terms of the public messaging as related to that summit, I thought they did a very good job of trolling South Korea and the United States by emphasizing the worst case scenario in terms of what Russia might provide to North Korea. And in so doing, I think that they are sending a worst possible case message, but there's this dynamic where if Russia goes too far with North Korea, then South Korea has a counter, which is direct supply of munitions to Ukraine. And likewise, if South Korea pursues direct supply of munitions to Ukraine, Russia now has a counter. And so I think that mutual deterrence dynamic is very interesting, but I don't think that it is very stable between the two. And so I think that is worth watching. Sumi covered a lot related to the NCG. I'm not going to get into that. Maybe I'll just make a couple of remarks about the election, because I do think that if we look at the bilateral relationship, that is probably the biggest potential risk to the robust cooperation that we see currently. And I agree with what Sumi said. I mean, the old stresses will return. The guardrails that had existed previously will be weaker. But I don't necessarily think we will have stresses, but I don't think that it necessarily portends an end to the relationship by any means. Rather, it creates an environment in which there are a few strategies that I think are clear from the past experience with President Trump that I anticipate South Korea might pursue. And those relate to holding on to institutionalization between the two sides, lobbying to maintain support in Congress, and maintaining strong positive public opinion in the United States as a hedge against possible negative actions by President Trump. And then also, I think just a couple of other lessons are that President Yoon will want to find a way to make sure that Trump doesn't run down South Korea because of the accomplishments that Biden made. And so he'll need to make some kind of quick deal that provides Trump with ownership over some of the same things that that we've already been doing in the alliance. And so I think that that is really the trick to changing the narrative as related to the possibility of a return to the Trump administration. I'll stop there.
Our last speaker will be Ambassador Joseph Yoon. I introduced that now he's enjoying a very powerful job where's my note? Okay, here. Special presidential envoy for compact negotiations, which means he was assigned as a Pacific czar, while Kurt was named as Asian czar, because he's controlled all policies in the Pacific Island, small countries. So now, which looms large in the U.S. in terms of importance of U.S. foreign policies towards China. Now I'm asking you just to narrow down two questions. What's the next most plausible topics for the U.S., Korea, Japan trilateral summit? I mean, kind of some the series of Camp David summit, and the second point is some other speakers has some briefly mentioned, but I want to ask your personal insight on the probability of re-election of former President Trump in the next presidential election, and in case, what is the best way for us to deal with new President Trump?
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Park. Great to be here. And Scott is starting a new job. I'm just finishing the job that Ambassador Park described 2 weeks ago. We signed my last agreement. I was negotiating with Marshall Islands, and that was very complicated because of nuclear legacy there. But now the agreement is with Congress, all three agreements. And until recently, we didn't have a speaker, obviously. Now that we have a speaker, I'm quite optimistic that Congress will approve the negotiated compacts. So I'm finished. So like Scott, do not call me U.S. official anymore. So let me, Ambassador Chey Park always asks the right questions, and so being the last foremost speaker here, I'd like to make 5 points. 3 seems too little, 7 seems too many, so 5 will do, I think. Number 1 is completely agree with what Danny and Susan have been saying, that the structural impediments to improving relations with China is not going to happen. So more than any other time since the end of Cold War, we are in a new Cold War. Obviously, the two are not exactly comparable, but we are in a new Cold War. I think we might as well call it that. People try to say de-risking. We're not decoupling, we're de-risking. We are competing, but we're not in conflict. But those are words only. We are in a conflict situation. We are veering towards much more serious situation. And to say that, everything's going to be fine, Biden is going to meet with Xi and they will put a flow on it, I think that is just being very, very optimistic. My second point, what does it mean for Northeast Asia that we are essentially entering a conflict era, likely a conflict era? I mean, you can call it stiff competition. I think if you look at Northeast Asia, this is where it is much more like Cold War than anyone else. We have now 3 countries on each side in a tightly aligned bloc. US, South Korea, Japan on one side, Russia, China, and North Korea on the other side. And, whether whether we accept it or not, the old conflicts are likely to be the ones that's going to be most troubled, Taiwan and Korean Peninsula. And so this new Cold War situation, dynamics, will once again, the conflict areas will likely, tensions will be there. Just looking at, obviously, U.S. alignment, I do think the United States feels quite comfortable with these emerging blocs. It would have been very hard for the U.S. to compete with China by itself. It will be very hard. So U.S. feels quite comfortable that we are beginning to develop these blocs. And I do think the Biden administration has done an incredibly successful job at managing alliances, no question. And the main architect for managing alliances in Asia Pacific, also of course Kurt Campbell, which is why I think he's been promoted to be Deputy Secretary at State. Don't quote me on this guy, by the way. And so, I mean, look what he's done in Asia Pacific. Obviously, strengthening alliance with Korea and Japan, but new initiatives such as AUKUS, which is bringing UK into it, into Indo-Pacific area, and then strengthening the Quad, which is India as well as Australia and Japan, into what is essentially a security arrangement. So there is a sense, if I were China, that in Asia Pacific at least, U.S. is encircling them, and this is why I do think people like Blinken and Jake Sullivan can do a victory lap on the success of the alliance. So what is the next step in terms of trilateral alliance relationship that Ambassador Park is asking? For Washington, the natural next big step would be a NATO-like alliance for the three countries, US, Japan, Korea, with like Article 5 possibilities of invoking that, which is a mutual defense treaty. I mean, at the moment, U.S. has a mutual defense treaty with South Korea, U.S. a mutual defense treaty with Japan, but South Korea and Japan does not have a mutual defense treaty. And quite honestly, if Washington had its way, they will be pushing 100% for a trilateral mutual defense treaty. I think Japan also feels relatively comfortable with this bloc idea, moving towards stronger U.S. camp along with Korea and everyone else. I think the least comfortable of the three is South Korea, obviously. And I would like to hear our friends' Korean views on that. President Yoon has taken an enormous step in trying to really improve Korea-Japan relationship. But so far, I don't think Japanese have reciprocated in any meaningful way. And this is where, there is a role for the U.S. to do that. If U.S. truly wants, and they do want, a trilateral defense treaty. On the other camp, the one that feels most comfortable moving on the blocks is North Korea. I mean, it's been, 10, 11 years, 12 years since Kim Jong-un became the supreme leader. He has never been more secure. He has never been more secure. He is not isolated anymore. I mean, Washington liked to pretend using, phrases like this is the most isolated state and so on. Completely not true. The borders with China are relatively open. He is doing, great trade in cyber. getting, resources from Russia. I mean, who would have thought he would be supplying weapons to Russia? So I think he's completely comfortable where he is. And North Korea is no longer isolated. And so that does beg the question, which I think Sumi and Scott touched on, which is denuclearization. And frankly, Sumi said it best, it's not gonna happen. It's in the Constitution, Just like US will never give up right to bear arms, North Korea will never give up nuclear weapons. And so to look for the old ways to work again, your roadmap based on, let's talk about Yongbyon, let's talk about, these small it's not going to work. And I guess what I would say is that you quoted 76% of South Koreans want indigenous nuclear weapons. We have to move towards that. And I think one way to engage North Korea is by taking nuclear weapons off the engagement map. And the only way you do that is South Korea's nuclear weapons. If both countries have nuclear weapons are no longer an issue for inter-Korean relationship. And so I do think now there are those in Washington who completely accept, and everyone accept, North Korea will not be denuclearized. So what do? And so either you accept it or you move to neutralize it by giving South Koreans nuclear weapons. And I do think ultimately there has to be a path to that. And there are many paths. I agree completely with Ambassador Park that we really do need alliance to be strengthened through economic deterrence factors. But also related to that, Japan now has always had uranium enrichment capability and even reprocessing. They're allowed to do that. So maybe some kind of trilateral arrangement on that. I think that would be a great idea. So in any case, my two thought items are: one, can US, Japan, Korea move to a trilateral mutual defense arrangement? Two, can we move to South Koreans getting nuclear weapons so that nuclear weapons are no longer what determines inter-Korean relations? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now it's high time for us to talk, to enter into the very interactive discussion with our distinguished, discussant and also participants from Korean side. Please, anybody who wants to raise a question, please, pick up your place card, and then briefly identify yourself, and please specify who want to respond to your respective questions. So, Ambassador An Ho-young and Ambassador Son Jae. Ambassador Son Jae is, appointed as, special envoy, special ambassador on the cultural, and to be followed by the General Shin. Okay.
I'm following your instruction, Ambassador Park, which means I'm starting by identifying myself. Mm-hmm. And then I think it makes a lot of sense because there are so many friends across the Pacific who are attending this conference at very late hour on Sunday evening. So I'm watching you. I do not know if you can see me, but I can see you very well. And then I should be joining Rexon by giving extra point to Danny for that mountain bike. I wonder how you could be riding mountain bike in Manhattan, but anyhow. So well, let me just try to respond to those 5 points by Joe. And then Joe started by saying, well, I'm no longer government official. And I said to myself, why does he say that? Maybe he is going to drop some bombshells. And then as a matter of fact, he did. And then with respect to the nuclear issue, then I will try to keep away from it. But let me just try to say something about the next step for trilateral, say, meeting among Korea, Japan, and then the United States. Well, that happened, I mean, Camp David meeting happened in August. And in the following month, in September, then there was that Vostocini meeting, to which you also referred to. And then at the time, there were many, say commentators in Korea saying this, which is that, well, what is going to happen now? What is going to happen is that the relations among something called the Southern Triangle, that is to say the relations among Korea, South Korea, Japan, and United States is going to be further strengthened, which is good. But at the same time, there will be a kind of action-reaction kind of, after effect. That is to say, it in fact would be leading to further strengthening of Northern Triangle. That is to say, North Korea, Russia, and China. What would be the consequence of that? There has been a lot of discussion about it. And I, in fact, was following all those discussions. And something which really occurred to my mind was this, which is that, well, Joe, one of the points you said was that, well, with whatever name we may call it, then we, in fact, are moving into a new Cold War period, right? And then I'm just referring to all those discussions we've been having in Seoul. And then something which really appealed to my mind was this, which is that, while by saying that, by admitting that we are moving into the new Cold War, would it be necessarily helpful for South Korea? In the sense that by accepting it, are we not letting, or are we not just endorsing this Northern Triangle among North Korea, Russia, and China? Would it be necessarily helpful for South Korean strategic situation? And then the answer would be no. So the suggestion was, well, in fact, it will make a lot of sense for us just try to take advantage of China feeling uncomfortable about Russia and North Korea. Well, Joe, you said maybe it's not the case that North Korea is as isolated as we wish to describe it, but at the same time, it in fact, I mean, between North Korea and Russia, they are the two countries who in fact are most blatantly in violation of something called rule-based international order. That's true. And then China, in fact, is not that. I mean, China, of course, has its own problem with rule-based international order, but at the same time, it has a lot of reasons why it should be, well, in comparison with Russia and in comparison with North Korea, should be behaving better than two of them. So wouldn't it better serve our purpose so that we will take advantage of that, so we do not just take it for granted that it will lead to further strengthening of Northern Triangle. So that, in fact, was a lot of discussions we had in Korea. And I said to myself, it makes sense. In my mind, it makes sense. And then it leads to, well, what do we say? Which is that general approach we have is, when we deal with strong, say, opponents, then try to reduce the pressure coming from the strong opponents. That adds to your advantage. So by splitting these relations among, say, North Korea, Russia, and China, rather than just giving or taking it as a fact, just try to take advantage of everything we have so that we could be, in a sense, splitting the relations among the three, undermining the relations among the three. That will be to our advantage of South Korea, advantage of the United States. So in that sense, well, I think it was last year in Bali when President Biden said, well, after the meeting with President Xi, he said, it need not be a Cold War. You remember that? Last year, when President Biden met with President Xi in Bali, after the meeting, he said, it need not be a Cold War. And I really appreciated it. And and then the fact that now there are so many, say, highest-ranking government officials of United States coming to visit China, and then now in 2 days' time, then of course President Biden is going to meet with President Xi. I think all those efforts will, in fact, even if it is true, Joe, this is something you already said that, which is the gap between United States and China, maybe that cannot be that easily well filled. I agree with that, but at the same time, I think these are nice gestures. Just try to keep certain distance between China on the one hand and then Russia and North Korea on the other hand. So that is my first point, and then my second point.
Please make it succinct.
In that case, I will just make it very simple, which is that, this is a point addressed to Sumi as well as to Scott, and I agree with both of you in your high appreciation of Washington Declaration as well as the NCG Nuclear Consultation Group. What I think is there should be something, say, tangible, which must come from the NCG meetings. And when I say something tangible, in my mind, it should be a kind of operational plan for the Combined Forces Command to deal with the nuclear threats coming from North Korea. So, we have been talking about what Kim Jong-un is feeling, what Kim Jong-un is doing, and then Kim Jong-un, one of the things which Kim Jong-un has been saying to his military leaders these days was, prepare your war plan based upon CNI, that is to say, conventional nuclear integration. That was something amazing. And then that, in fact, is something which I think we should be developing between Korea and then the United States, or more specifically for the CFC operational plans. And then my third and last point would be, this, in fact, would be, any of U.S. participants who would be willing to address this question, which is last month in October, there was a report issued, which was Congressional Commission on Strategic Posture of the United States. That, in fact, was a report mandated by NDAA last year. And then I just went through the report, and I was quite impressed with one of the recommendations included in that report, which was, maybe this is the time we must be addressing deployment of theater nuclear weapons in Asia Pacific. Deploying theater nuclear weapons in Asia Pacific. So many questions came up in my mind. For example, what does the report mean? By the way, I should be reminding you, the commission which came up with the report included many people whom I know, whom I respect, like Rose Goldmiller, or like General John Hyten. So I, in fact, was quite impressed about that particular point included in that commission report, saying we must be addressing deployment of theater nuclear weapons in Asia Pacific. So I was wondering what is meant by theater nuclear weapon. Is it INF? Is it tactical nuclear weapon? So, that in fact, and then what in fact would be the implication of that for some of the things we've been discussing about, say, redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
Next, Ambassador Son.
Hello, good morning. Hello, good morning. I'm trying to adjust volume here. It's great to see everybody on the screen, through Zoom, and here in person. It was a very insightful and really wise comments by all of our friends from the U.S. We learned a lot, and I, as Ambassador Park said, I have assumed this new, I call myself the quasi-ambassador for cultural cooperation. But one of the things that this new role allows me to do is sort of get invited to these international conferences, thinking that, cultural cooperation is a great thing to talk about alongside all these foreign policy risks and economic risks. So I get to talk about culture and then listen in on everybody else talking about these big important threats in the political and the economic world. So I've been to a few places recently and I've talked to a few different people from different parts of the world, and it's sort of basically been middle power countries like Canada, Qatar, the Middle East, and other parts of Asia. And the feeling that I'm getting is that while you are talking about U.S. foreign policy and how you're sort of being able to manage all of these different conflicts at once, outside of the U.S., there's a growing concern that you are spreading yourself too thin, that you are keeping, you're sticking your finger in all these different holes in the dikes, but there's a limit to how much is that you are able to do so. So there is that aspect of physical capability. If there's another, a real serious dam that breaks, that the U.S. will not be able to control. And so there's a lot of people are trying to test the waters to see how much it is going. So there's the testing going on. But there's the second aspect of it is that even though, and Joe is right, that the Biden administration seems to be doing a really good diplomatic job at the moment of handling all of these geographical concerns, and a lot of people around the world are right now looking at the U.S. as doing a positive role. But hovering over everybody is the fact that in a few months, all of this can be pulled, it will be gone. We here at the Chey Institute a few months ago had another seminar in which top think tanks from the U.S. came and talked about U.S.'s global leadership. And at the end of this talk, we asked them, what is the number one thing that you think will topple U.S. from global leadership? And all of them, and on the last one didn't say because they didn't want to repeat what everybody else said, was Trump. Trump is the number one danger factor for U.S.'s future global leadership. And without taking that into consideration, not just outside the U.S., everyone that really deals with the U.S. now has that in the back of their minds. And so a lot of these middle power countries right now are hedging their risks. That you cannot put all your eggs in the U.S. basket at the present time. And so they're hedging their risks by, the regional, the fragmentation that we're talking about in terms of strategic, in terms of economic, risks, and they're reaching out to each other within the region, but also across regions. And this is why Korea gets increasingly, not just for the culture, invited to these global workshops, because these middle powers, wherever they are in the world, are trying to form alliances that will provide some other security and a lot of different kind of security in the future in the case that Trump is elected. But even if he's not elected, there is a lot of concern about the future political leadership in the U.S. that is forcing a lot of other parts of the world to think of contingency policies. And so my question is, U.S. foreign policy at the crossroads, and Joe says, the U.S. is very favorable to these formation of blocs, but what is it actually doing to maybe ensure that these kind of blocs maintain the kind of value system that the U.S. is trying to put forth? And is there a contingency plan even within the U.S. foreign policy world in the Trump contingency? and what are we going to see in the future? I'm not sure who's going to be the best person to answer, but it's something that I've been wanting to ask. Thank you.
Thank you. If you are, I think the comment by our colleague from Korean side is very, very important. But if we focused on the comment, we don't have to listen to the second presentation because you just make some comment. But if you concentrate on the questions, I have to ask all of my, Avengers, to reply. So next speaker will be, General Shin. Please make it a little succinct. Okay?
Oh, yes, sir. I'm Major Retired Shin, and now I'm the Secretary General of Korea U.S. Alliance Foundation. I have actually two questions to our great the 6 U.S. Avengers on the Korean issue. My question is actually to the Korean issue, and everybody in this room and in this network, and they clearly understand the importance of the alliance and the seriousness of the North Korean nuclear and the missile threat. But my question is, how about in the U.S. Capitol Hill? How many senators are aware and understand that and emphasize the Korean issue, especially North Korean nuclear and the missile threat? If not, then much high recognition in the U.S. Capitol Hill, what we should do as an ally. My second question is related to the first one. In the military, in the military you have like a main efforts and the supporting efforts. And also in the strategy, you have priorities. And if North Korea invaded and seized the YP-do and PY-do and threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons, I'm pretty sure that in that kind of situation, the ROC military retaliated not only that the source of origin, but the headquarters as a kind of a self-defense right. In this situation, and also possibly China may isolate Taiwan militarily using their naval capabilities. So now you have the situation in Ukraine and Taiwan and Israel and Korea. And so my question is, what is the number one priority from that perspective of the U.S.? Really, North Korea can be a high priority to deter and to actually respond to that threat? That is my question. Thank you.
Very challenging questions. After we listen to the Professor Lee Jae-sung, and then I will invite some response from my U.S. panelist. Okay, and then to be followed by Dr. Jeon Sung-hoon and Dr. Kim Kwang-jin and also Dr. James Kim. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I will try to be brief. Okay, and I will also I will jump a little bit a little bit to the western side, Ukraine and Middle East also. When I saw the title of today's workshop, it was very rare that we are talking about U.S. foreign policy at a crossroad, and we are talking about 4 fronts: Ukraine, the Middle East, Taiwan, and North Korea. And that is simultaneous threat. And I think this is very unusual situation. We are talking about new Cold War, but actually having 4 fronts at the same time is also a very unusual situation. Then my question is, well, basically most of the panelists, but anyone can answer, how independently those 4 fronts will be handled from the Washington side. So will the United States have the proper capacity to handle these 4 fronts separately with proper attention while maintaining the solidarity of the West? Or another possibility will be what I would like to call the Goldilocks choice trap. Not too hot, not too warm, but somewhat lukewarm, but easily accessible. For example, kind of the quick ceasefire in Israel-Hamas, the situation, relatively quicker ceasefire in Ukraine. If this kind of template will be made, then what will happen to Taiwan? What will happen to especially South and North Korea? That may even give some sort of tacit advantage to the revisionist power, provoking some sort of crisis, but somehow ending up with the Goldilocks choice situation. Will it lead to another equilibrium, or Washington D.C. is still wary of this kind of the easy Goldilocks choice trap? So,
thank you. Now I'd like to Rexon. Thank you.
All right. I'll be brief, but I'll try to cover. I'll give you my views on much of what's been asked. On our presidential process, here's what I would say. It's impossible to predict which way our election will go right now. It's quite possible you could have President Trump elected again. What I would offer to you, having watched elections, having worked very closely in the political sphere, although not directly in it, is to not take any one data point between now and our election as the authoritative indicator of which way the elections will go. That the trend lines are what matters, and you look at polling. And just to give you an example, my personal view, we saw a poll last week in 5 or 6 battleground states that had Trump up in 5 of the 6. And then 2 days later, we saw the Democrats winning handily across several contested elections. Very hard to know which one of those to read, but what I would tell you is look at data points that give you actual voter sentiment over polling right now. So look at trend lines and look at actual voter sentiment. But it's quite possible, Ambassador, to your point. And I hear and see in my travels the hedging right now. There's no question of that. And so the second thing I would say on our politics is if Donald Trump is elected again, I would submit, I don't think we have a paradigm in our modern political history in the United States that is a reference point for how he would approach a second term. So there was some discussion earlier about how does President Yoon position himself versus a new second term of President Trump. You have to think through those questions now, but I would not use historical paradigms or precedents to think through what does that actually mean when he comes, because I think his approach to his administration will look unlike anything we have seen. General, on your question of the Hill's views, I think there's a growing recognition of the growing riskiness and danger with North Korea. I want to commend Scott for your emphasis on this Russia-Korea nexus, North Korea nexus, and not necessarily what it means for what we think they may have done today, but where it could go. Because I think that is highlighting something that has a particular amount of risk here that brings these theaters together in ways that I think we're still grappling in Washington, I would argue, to understand the implications. But it's clear, and Joe said it, and I 100% agree, that it certainly seems from Washington that North Korea feels as secure as probably it's felt in quite some time in order to do what it's done with Russia in particular. The question around decision-making and handling fronts, I do want to remind people that if you look back over the last 20 years, the United States has gone through episodes where we've had two active war fronts that we've grappled with, where we've deployed hundreds of thousands of troops into Iraq and Afghanistan at the same time as we've managed the risk of a nuclear, not a nuclear, but a preemptive Israeli attack on Iran, as well as the situation of Taiwan and North Korea at the time. So managing multiple fronts for the United States is something that we have done and we are doing. And I feel relatively confident of that point from the perspective of our capacity in Washington, our foreign policy capacity around the world, as well as our military capacity that has been buttressed, again, I think in unprecedented ways by decisions that have been made here, in Tokyo, in Australia, in Europe, where we have far more alliance capacity today than we ever have. And so there are stresses and challenges. I absolutely agree with that, and we read a lot about them in terms of military resupply. But we've had in the not distant future, just in the last 20 years, had multiple fronts that have been managed. We've made mistakes, but we manage multiple fronts.
Before I invite the remaining five other panelists, to save time, for the purpose of efficiency, I'd like to invite the remaining three colleagues from floor, Dr. John and Kim and James Kim. Okay, Dr. John Sung-won. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'll be very short. I have one comment and one question to Rexon RYU and very brief comments on Jo-yoon. From the military perspective, I think that the war in Ukraine and the Middle East is different in that, as you said, in case of Ukraine, it will take a long time, at least a year, and depending on U.S. presidential election, it can go on or, likely to end abruptly. But in case of Middle East, due to the, this enormous military capability of Israel, I think that the war has relatively short period of time. But from political, diplomatic, and strategic perspective, the two are same. Simply because what happens after the end of the war is full of uncertainty, instability, and increased tension. We do not expect or forecast how the situation will go, positive way or more negative way. That means I think there's a two huge distractions American foreign policy is facing and will face in the future. Quite a long period of time. And I think the implication of that, this uncertainty is what today's title of the workshop catches. U.S. foreign policy is at the crossroad. Especially, I think, the Indo-Pacific strategy will be at the crossroad. You talk about, this ready and an enormous capability still remains in the Asia Pacific. But if you read today's Wall Street Journal report, U.S. Patriot missile batteries supposed to be in Guam will relocating to Middle East. And there is attack on U.S. base eastern part of Syria, and there was casualties. That actually increased the distractions, the weight of the distractions American foreign policy will face. So many people will growingly suspect whether American Indo-Pacific strategy will remain as viable as you hope to be now. That's my comment. And if you read the Biden's administration nuclear posture review, there is a term called deterrence dilemma. U.S. government is facing deterrence dilemma when you provide extended nuclear deterrence. And my question is, what can you tell us about what that term means in the context of Korean security? In my comments to Jo-Yoon, you throw out two very important questions. On the denuclearization issue, I fully agree with you. Denuclearization turned out to be a fancy. The hope for first best solution, we now all agree that it's not achievable, right? So we have to find out alternative, second best solution, as you alluded, that's nuclear parity on the Korean Peninsula. And once achieving this nuclear parity, we can move on with the more active engagement with North Korea, which may be the only way to change North Korean system, which will eventually lead to denuclearization, right? But I'm not sure whether your trilateral, this military bloc, the small version of Asian NATO, will be viable, simply because among the countries having a territorial issues, as you know, Japan claims a territorial dispute issue with South Korea, which we do not agree with. But once there is territorial dispute issues, I think there is a limit that those countries can, deepen their security collaboration. So unless these fundamental issues are, resolved, I think you should be refrained from, overly, optimistic about the future trilateral military collaboration. Thank you.
General Kim.
I'm Kwang-Jin Kim. I'm a retired Air Force Brigadier General. I'm working in Sungmyeong Women's University now. I have two comments in Ukraine wars. So I wanted to talk about the 2 points in Ukraine war. Those are related to the U.S. military aid and the U.S. response against the Russian nuclear saber rattling. That pretty much they're interested in concerning in many of the U.S. allies, including South Korea. First of all, U.S. military aid is a very critical component for Ukraine military defense capability against the Russian invasion. So Ukraine military dependency on U.S., NATO, and EU's military and financial aid have been increased. But now the U.S. aid to Israel may affect the amount of the military aid to Ukraine. And I think that at this time, the U.S. budget on military aid to Ukraine in this debate in the U.S. Congress. So I think it is time to find the additional alternative to assist to continue assist to the Ukraine military even after cutting off the U.S. military aid. So whether or not the NATO or the EU may compensate for the loss of the U.S. military aid is a very important point to continue assisting Ukraine the military operations. And this very at this time, many of the U.S. allies are watching and looking at how United States deal with this situation. Second point is that related to Russian nuclear saber rattling. So at this time, so far, Russia did not make the nuclear ultimatum, but Russia frequently showed the implicit threat by the verbal messaging and changing the status of each own nuclear force. But interestingly, so far the NATO and U.S. leaders frequently respond to Russia whenever the Russia make the verbal nuclear threat. Even though there is no extended deterrence commitment on Ukraine. Also, some neutral countries like China and India sent a very clear message to Russia to deny the Russian use of nuclear options. So it's not unclear whether NATO's response or the neutral countries' response to dissuade the use of the Russian nuclear option. But I think as long as the war continues, the Russian nuclear saber rattling continues to remain. So at this time, the United States may consider to clarify the commitment for Ukraine, very focusing on only the nuclear threat issues, in order to avoid Russian temptation to use nuclear threat, nuclear option. So I think it's not necessary to make the commitment for Ukraine, such as the bilateral defense pact or the new membership of the collective alliance. But United States may think about consider some partial or specific commitment to protect Ukraine from the Russian nuclear threat. There is another point that many the U.S. allies are watching how United States to deal with this situation. Let me stop here.
Thank you. Okay, Danny, can you make any comment?
I'd speak to two of the issues that were raised. First, with respect to the possible second term for Donald Trump, although of course I agree that we shouldn't assume that he will be reelected. I think the two things to bear in mind are, number one, that any and all U.S. administrations, to greater or lesser extent, are going to be driven by U.S. national interests. And it is in the U.S. national interest, particularly in the context of strategic rivalry with China, to maintain a sound alliance and a strong partnership with key allies like the Republic of Korea and Japan. Not to suggest that it wouldn't be potentially very turbulent. In terms of what to do to hedge against the possibility of a second Trump term, I think the answer is fairly straightforward, which is let's make as much progress as fast as we possibly can and build the maximum amount of public support in the United States for the alliance and the partnership by showcasing how much this contributes to the U.S. economic and security interests. So, number one. Secondly, with respect to the nightmare scenario of the Ukraine war, Israel's operation in Gaza being combined with North Korean provocation and Chinese action against Taiwan, I think that, just like they say, we love all of our children equally. I think the President of the United States takes all of his crises seriously. As Rexon pointed out, we don't have troops in the field, and we have managed multiple crises in our history. In the case of these four flashpoints, we have very capable partners, and we have unprecedented alliance capabilities. That is particularly true with the ROK in deterring or defending against North Korea, and it's particularly true with Israel as well. In Ukraine, the Europeans have a lot to offer, although there is, a significant degree of Ukraine fatigue, so to speak. But to the extent that the ability of the U.S. to contribute was diminished, one could imagine more European stepping up to the challenge. And Taiwan clearly is a security partner that needs a considerable amount of help. But we're not talking about the physical limit of deploying U.S. soldiers to fight. We're talking about the bandwidth of policymakers. And while there's a limit, the fact is, I think that they are capable of delegating and of managing even multiple simultaneous crises. Thank you.
I forgot James.
Ambassador Park, I was going to ask a question before when I raised my card, before Ambassador Son and Professor Lee pointed out, sort of raised two questions about the bandwidth, and Mr. Shin also raised the issue about ordering principle. And I think Danny and Rexon did a really good job of answering those questions. So since you gave me the mic, I'd like to take the opportunity to just say thanks for the really stimulating discussion and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Sumi, do you have anything to add on your very comprehensive comment?
Just quickly, I just want to echo Rexon's comments in just answering the question about senators and Congress interest on North Korea, which is there, and on the sanctions front and other issues. Of course, there's a lot of interest in countering the North Korea's increasing illicit activities, and Rexon and Scott talked about North Korea and Russia's relationship and arms deal, but also other illicit activities, such as cybercrime, increasing crypto capabilities, which allows, obviously, the Kim regime to steal hundreds of millions of dollars, which then the regime can use for retaliation and coercion, espionage, sabotage, and all of that. So there's interest in that. And on just 10 seconds on the human rights issue, because we didn't get to cover it at all today, but this should be part of Washington's overall North Korea approach. And I would just say, the legislation reauthorizing the North Korea Human Rights Act of 2004 for additional 5 years was passed in December. There's even a longer term, like information penetration campaign, which, I really should be part of an overall USS North Korea policy and strategy. The 2023 National Defense Authorization Act requires the president to develop a strategy to really combat North Korea's this kind of repressive information environment, and authorizes $10 million annually for 5 years to increase U.S. government-sponsored broadcasting and information dissemination into North Korea. Since we didn't get to talk about it, I just plug in that 30-second comment there.
Thank you. Susan?
Yes, I can hear you. I don't have much to add. You had asked me about some of the economic issues with respect to the disposition of U.S.-China relations going forward, and how the record level trade from last year might look going forward, and what does that say about U.S.-China relations? I mean, I think, we'll continue to see how the trade picture plays out, but I do expect to see diminishing flows between the U.S. and China. We've seen huge drop-offs in investment flows between the two, and some drop-offs in trade flows and diversion of trade as well. Trade counted as coming from other countries in Asia that's really basically coming directly from China. So I think we'll continue to see see those flows diminish. And I mean, we don't really know how far the de-risking is going to go, but I think it will just basically continue, depending a little bit on the politics and what happens, maybe in the political season in the U.S. and what happens in the election. But I think there's going to be a very strong message coming from the U.S. With respect to China on things like standards, and that'll make it very hard to continue the kind of flows that we've seen in the past. So I just expect it to continue to diminish over time.
Yeah, great. And Ambassador Joe, Yoon?
I don't have really much to add, except a couple of things Ambassador An and General Chun raised, which is what is the South Korean space in between China and US and Japan? you know? And what is the expectation, for example, of Washington, you know? I would just point out that Washington's expectation is quite big. And I think the one thing that has really improved the bilateral relations is the commitment shown by President Yoon that South Korea is a reliable ally. And so I think that strategy will also work with Trump. Trump, when he came in, to be frank with you, was not happy with South Korea because of the reputation as a little bit unreliable ally, you know? And so that was really beginning of some trouble between Trump administration and South Korean administration at the time. So, I mean, you know, obviously that's the calculation of South Korea, very much so. But I think more you study expectations of United States, then there is, you know, certainly room that you can use to the advantage of South Korea. Thank you.
And Scott?
Yeah, I only have 2 points that I want to add. One is that with all four of these conflicts, what we see is the U.S. pursuing, as has already been stated, a strategy that is focused on proxies and prevention. But in the event of the outbreak of a conflict on the Korean Peninsula, that's where we have a formal treaty commitment. And so I actually think that that would supersede these others. But I do think that the Middle East offers a challenge in terms of the priority politically in the United States on managing that region and trying to resist contagion. And then my second point is really about this issue of, I differ with Joe a little bit on the triangles. I think that we are not yet talking about blocs. I think we're talking about coalitions. And I would agree with Ambassador Ahn that there is a window of opportunity for us to try to, I think that our cohesion in the US, Japan, South Korea triangle is better. And we should be also mindful of the opportunity to dissuade cohesion in the Russia, North Korea, China triangle. And there may be a near-term window of opportunity for that, but we'll have to see how it plays out longer term.
Thank you. Now, it's very risky for me to test your tolerance before the wonderful luncheon. So we successfully shed a light on the bright side and murky side in every aspect. So, but still we have we are faced with uncertainties. That is the future election of the U.S. presidential, campaign. So I think it might be more useful for us to resume this kind of comprehensive talks, fronting, multifaceted frontiers at the time. Maybe the most next timing, appropriate timing is in the wake of next U.S. election. So we'll, collect, we should enjoy, more collective wisdom surrounding us. Okay, again, thanks so much. Especially, I really appreciate for your taking time through Zoom, with very short notice. But your insight and your advice is invaluable, as always the case in the past. Thank you so much. Let's send up big hands